Somewhere deep in the Peruvian Amazon, water is flowing through the jungle, hot enough to cook an animal alive. You can hear it before you reach it. A low, constant simmer. Steam rises from the surface and disappears into a wall of green, nearly 18 meters high, which is about 60 feet. The river is real. It has a name, Shane Tempishka, an ancient Asháninka name meaning boiled with the heat of the sun. People living beside it knew about it long before scientists did. At its hottest point, the water has reached around 99 degrees Celsius, which is about 210 degrees Fahrenheit, just 1 degree below the temperature at which water boils at sea level. Even along its main hot stretch, the average temperature is around 86 degrees Celsius, about 186 degrees Fahrenheit. The water stays that hot for nearly 6 kilometers, about 4 miles, flowing through the heart of a rainforest where ordinary tropical rivers are nowhere near this temperature. A frog falling from a branch above the water does not simply get swept downstream, its eyes cloud white. Its body begins cooking before it can reach the other side. And yet, the strangest part is not the heat, it is where that heat comes from. The nearest active volcano is more than 700 kilometers away, about 435 miles. The river sits above ancient sedimentary rock, far from a plate boundary, and with no known magma chamber beneath it. For centuries, stories about this place survived among the people who lived beside it. Scientists had a different problem. The geology said a river like this should not exist. Then, in 2011, researchers began measuring it. They found the river was not a legend, it was something even stranger. Because if there is no volcano heating the water, something else must be doing it. And whatever is happening here has created an environment where life is being forced to survive conditions that should be lethal. The forest around it may hold another warning. In tonight's journey, we're going into the Amazon to uncover what is actually heating this river, what can possibly survive inside water this hot, and why one of the strangest rivers on Earth may be telling us something important about the hidden machinery beneath the rainforest. Before we step into the heat, if you're enjoying stories that take you somewhere you've never seen before, give the video a like and subscribe. And if you're starting your day with this, or settling in for the night, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Settle down now, and let's follow the steam into the forest. For most of Earth's hot springs, the trail of heat can be followed downward. Rain enters the ground, moves through fractures, and encounters rock warmed by deeper geological activity. In volcanic regions, that warmth often comes from magma or from rocks heated by a nearby magmatic system. Along active plate boundaries, the movement and deformation of the crust can add another source of heat. These processes create the familiar geothermal landscapes found in places such as Iceland, Yellowstone, and New Zealand, where hot water has a geological furnace close enough to the surface to keep it warm. The pattern matters because heat behaves differently from water. A drop of rain can travel through rock, but the surrounding stone gradually absorbs and redistributes thermal energy. For a spring to remain extremely hot at the surface, some mechanism must continually supply that energy. In the usual geothermal model, the closer the water gets to a deep heat source, the hotter it becomes. The farther that source lies from the surface, the more difficult it becomes to maintain extraordinary temperatures without another pathway carrying the heat upward. The Peruvian Amazon occupies a very different setting. Much of this region rests on the South American craton, a massive foundation of exceptionally old continental rock. It has remained comparatively stable for immense stretches of geological time, far removed from the volcanic landscapes that make famous geothermal fields So easy to explain. There is no active volcano beside Shanay and no known shallow magma chamber waiting beneath the rainforest. The Andes provide the nearest major volcanic and geothermal region, roughly 435 miles to the west. That separation changes the entire calculation. Heat from a distant mountain chain cannot move through cold, dense rock across hundreds of miles with enough intensity to maintain a river at temperatures approaching boiling. The energy would disperse through the crust long before producing anything resembling the water flowing through Mayantuyaku. Ordinary rainfall should therefore follow a much simpler path. Water enters the soil, filters downward, exchanges minerals with rock, and eventually returns to the surface at a temperature shaped by the surrounding ground and the depth it reached. In this part of the Amazon, that process should produce water that is cool, warm, or perhaps naturally heated in small pockets. It should not produce a continuous thermal system extending for miles. Geologists had another clue in the absence of something. The landscape lacks the usual signs that announce a volcanic heat source, such as young lava, recent eruptions, or the chemical character commonly associated with magma driven fluids. The rainforest conceals much of the underlying structure from view, yet the broad geological setting remains stubbornly clear. That leaves a remarkable tension between surface and subsurface. Above ground, the Amazon presents an environment shaped by rainfall, vegetation, rivers, and seasonal flooding. Far below, something is gathering enough thermal energy to alter one of those rivers on an extraordinary scale. The usual rule has taken us as far as it can. The river remains, carrying heat that the surrounding geology does not appear equipped to provide through the conventional route. Its existence turns the question of geothermal heat into a problem of movement, depth, pressure, and fractured rock, where water can travel much farther through the earth than its surface appearance suggests. The first warning is carried by the body itself. Near the hottest reaches, contact with the water can destroy skin in seconds. At temperatures approaching the boiling point, heat moves into tissue with extraordinary speed, overwhelming the protective layers that normally separate an animal from its surroundings. A brief fall can become a chain of injuries before there is enough time to find the bank again. For a small creature, the sequence begins with thermal shock. The nervous system receives an immediate flood of signals from the sudden heat, while the heart and circulation struggle under the extreme temperature. Cardiac arrest can follow rapidly. Muscles lose their normal coordination. Movement becomes frantic and unproductive, and the animal may lose the ability to direct itself toward cooler water. At the surface, damage continues with every second of exposure. Proteins in the skin and other tissues begin losing their natural structure, a process called denaturation. Living tissue starts to break apart under heat that the body has no mechanism to regulate. The eyes are especially vulnerable. Their delicate proteins respond rapidly to the surrounding temperature, and the clear tissues that allow vision can become cloudy and opaque. From the riverbank, this change can appear as a milky film spreading across the eyes of an animal caught in the current. Andres Russo documented this effect during fieldwork, observing animals that entered the hot water and watching their eyes change within moments. Breathing creates another pathway for injury. A struggling animal can inhale water while trying to keep its head above the surface. The lungs, already stressed by the surrounding heat, become filled with fluid while the body loses the coordination needed for escape. Once exhaustion takes over, the current carries the animal farther from cooler margins. The body eventually becomes buoyant and remains at the surface, carried along by water still moving downstream. The danger begins before direct contact. Steam rising from the hottest sections contains enough thermal energy to injure exposed skin especially when a person leans close to the surface. Moist heat transfers energy more efficiently than dry air, allowing vapor to scald tissue rapidly. Along the margins, mud and stones can also become intensely heated. An animal approaching the river to drink may step onto ground hot enough to injure its feet before its mouth reaches the water. The river also contains temperature gradients that make its danger uneven. Some stretches are cooler by several degrees, producing narrow margins where survival is possible. An animal that falls into the hottest water may instinctively struggle toward one of these cooler patches, following the impulse to escape extreme heat. The difficulty is distance. A few seconds in near boiling water can cause enough injury to make coordinated movement impossible. Across nearly 6 kilometers, which is about 4 miles, the river becomes a moving sequence of thermal zones. At its widest points, it can reach about 25 meters, which is about 82 feet, leaving no easy leap from one bank to the other. Water at this temperature obeys the same physical laws as heated water anywhere else. The difference is scale. Here, the heat is spread through a natural river, moving continuously through a living forest, turning ordinary contact between animal and water into a biological sequence that can unfold within moments. At first glance, Asháninka looks like a river that has simply wandered into the wrong climate. Its channel stretches through the forest with the proportions of an ordinary waterway, yet the details begin to separate it from everything around it. In places, the river reaches about 25 meters, which is about 82 feet from bank to bank. Some sections descend to roughly 6 meters, which is about 20 feet, giving the water enough depth for a person to swim if the temperature allowed such a thing. The hot portion continues for nearly 6 kilometers, which is about 4 miles, before the river approaches the Pacatea and begins surrendering its heat. That length gives the system a different character from a spring or isolated thermal pool. Water is moving continuously through a defined channel, gathering discharge from the riverbed as it travels. The surface can appear almost ordinary from a distance, until the steam and unusual color reveal that something deeper is shaping the water. Instead of the familiar brown tones of many Amazonian rivers, Asháninka can carry a faint turquoise cast. Minerals dissolved in the water influence its color, while pale stones line portions of the banks. Deposits accumulate where water repeatedly reaches the edges, leaving surfaces marked by the chemistry of the river itself. The effect changes with sunlight, depth, and the amount of mineral material suspended or dissolved in the flow. Above those banks, vegetation rises rapidly into the surrounding forest. In places, the walls of greenery reach about 18 meters, which is about 60 feet, creating a narrow corridor beneath the canopy. Steam rises into that vegetation and disperses among the leaves, while roots and branches remain only a short distance from water hot enough to injure exposed tissue. The boundary between rainforest and geothermal water can therefore be only a few feet of soil and stone. Along the river, one location carries a particular importance. It is called La Bomba, meaning the pump, and it marks the strongest known thermal discharge. Here, heated water pushes upward through openings in the riverbed, adding energy to the flowing channel from below. The surface responds to that pressure with irregular movement, as though the riverbed itself were sending pulses into the current. At La Bamba, measurements have reached about 99 degrees Celsius or 210 degrees Fahrenheit. The water around this point is therefore shaped by two movements at once. The river carries its flow downstream, while hot water rises from below and enters the channel. Each contribution alters the temperature and chemistry around it. Farther downstream, the heat begins to lose its dominance as cooler water enters the system and the river approaches its meeting point with the Pakatia. There, the character of the river changes within a relatively narrow zone. Near boiling water encounters the cooler river, creating a visible boundary where the steam thins and the water becomes suitable for bathing. The Asháninka have recognized this transition for generations, using their knowledge of the river's changing conditions to distinguish the places where the water can be approached from those where it cannot. The entire system can therefore be read along its length, from ordinary flowing water to La Bamba and onward into the cooler junction, with each stretch carrying a different expression of the same underground heat. A story can remain dormant for years, carried from one conversation into another without asking to be tested. For Andres Russo, the boiling river began that way. He was about 8 years old when he heard about it at his grandfather's dining table in Lima, Peru. The account belonged to an old Spanish story connected with the conquest of the Inca, and it described a river whose water was hot enough to boil. To a child, the Amazon already had room for creatures that seemed impossible, so the detail settled into memory without demanding an explanation. As he grew older, the story followed a very different path from the rest of those childhood imaginings. Russo became a geophysicist and studied the heat stored inside Earth. His training gave him the tools to understand geothermal systems, while also giving him a strong reason to doubt the river. A waterway approaching boiling temperature should have required a recognizable source of heat, and the Peruvian Amazon did not resemble the places where such systems usually occur. For roughly 12 years, the story remained a curiosity tucked into the background of his life. The old account returned during his doctoral research. Russo was working on a geothermal map of Peru when the remembered river surfaced again in conversation with colleagues. He asked whether anyone had heard of a boiling river in the Amazon. He expected skepticism, perhaps a laugh, or an explanation that the tale had grown through generations of retelling. The response changed the shape of the story. Several people recognized the description. At the time, there was no established scientific record for a river of this kind in the region, so these accounts occupied an unusual space between oral history and an untested geological claim. Russo had something rare in science, a reason to doubt, paired with enough evidence to investigate. Several people recognized the description. Others had heard related accounts. One person knew of a family connection to a place where such a river was said to exist. None of these reports amounted to scientific proof, yet their agreement gave the legend a different quality. A single extraordinary story can be dismissed as distortion. Multiple independent accounts pointing toward the same place create something worth examining. That distinction mattered to Russo. The question was no longer whether the river sounded plausible from a textbook perspective. The useful step was to find the place and measure it. His geological training, which had once made the story seem impossible, now provided the means to test it. Reaching the river required a journey through terrain that made the old accounts feel less remote. The route included a long drive, travel by canoe, and an hour of hiking through dense forest with a shaman's apprentice serving as guide. The expedition was still shaped by the practical knowledge of people who already knew the river, its pathways, and its boundaries. When Russo finally reached the bank, observation gave way to measurement. He brought out a thermometer and placed it into the water. The reading was far beyond what he expected from an Amazonian river. He checked it again, then repeated the process at other points. The instrument offered no legend, no inherited story, and no interpretation. It gave a temperature. That number transformed a childhood memory into a physical observation, and a story carried for years into the beginning of a scientific record. A sound reached Andres Russo before the river itself came fully into view. It was a steady, bubbling, and hissing from the channel, an acoustic detail that belonged more naturally to heated water than to a rainforest stream. As he moved closer, warmth reached his face. The air above the water carried heat outward, making the approach feel different from any ordinary riverbank. The warmth was noticeable before his boots reached the edge, arriving as a physical change in the space around him. Steam lifted from the surface in narrow columns and drifted toward the canopy. Through the morning light, the vapor softened the boundary between water and forest, while the current continued moving beneath it. Russo also noticed the color. The water carried a pale turquoise tint, with mineral deposits visible along the stones. Its appearance differed from the dark, tannin-rich water common in many Amazonian waterways. Then came the measurement. A thermometer entered the river, and the reading settled far outside the range Russo had expected. He checked the instrument again. Then he moved to another point and measured once more. Repetition mattered. A single unusual reading could come from a faulty instrument, an exposed sensor, or a local pocket of heated water. Several consistent measurements across different locations described something much larger. The temperature was approaching the boiling point of water at sea level. In metric terms, the hottest readings reached about 99 degrees Celsius, or 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Such heat required a source, and the measurement therefore carried a geological implication along with the number itself. Every additional reading strengthened the same observation. This was a river system carrying extraordinary heat through a landscape with no obvious volcanic furnace nearby. The senses offered clues that the thermometer alone could not provide. The water carried mineral odors, including traces associated with sulfur and iron. Those substances occur naturally in groundwater and rocks, so their presence did not by itself identify a volcanic origin. Their concentrations and overall chemical pattern would have to be examined carefully before the source of the heat could be understood. Russo contacted his doctoral supervisor from the riverbank and described what the measurements were showing. The conversation marked a change in the character of the discovery. Until that moment, the river had been a remarkable physical place encountered in the field. Now it had become a scientific problem that required evidence from several branches of earth science. Each observation added another piece. Heat was present in the water and surrounding air. Steam rose from the moving surface. Mineral-rich water emerged through the forest. Most importantly, repeated measurements showed that the extraordinary temperature was not confined to a single accidental pocket. The measuring instrument itself became part of the memory. When its sensor entered the water, steam curled around the equipment as heat transferred into the cooler surface of the device. Russo later described that physical sensation as something that remained striking even after repeated visits. For a geoscientist, the significance lay in the agreement between experience and measurement. The river could be heard, felt, seen, smelled, and measured, with each sense describing the same unusual environment from a different angle. The first visit had transformed an inherited story into a documented observation, and the numbers on the thermometer gave the place a physical reality that could be carried beyond the forest. The volcano was the obvious suspect, so scientists began by looking for its fingerprints. A hidden reservoir of molten rock could have explained the extraordinary heat, even if no crater or recent eruption appeared anywhere nearby. Geothermal systems connected to magma tend to leave chemical traces in the water above them. Chloride, sulfate, dissolved gases such as carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide can become concentrated when groundwater interacts with hot volcanic fluids and surrounding rock. Samples from Shanay Timpishka told a different story. Their chemistry showed water that had spent a long time moving through rock, collecting minerals along its underground route. The proportions of dissolved substances did not resemble the characteristic mixture expected from direct contact with a magmatic system. That distinction mattered because temperature alone could not identify the source. Water can become extremely hot underground through ordinary geothermal heating when it travels deeply enough and remains under pressure for long periods. The physical setting offered another line of evidence. A magma chamber close enough to maintain such a powerful thermal system should leave structural signals in the surrounding crust. Seismic methods allow researchers to examine how vibrations move through underground layers, revealing changes in density, composition, and the presence of large molten regions. Surveys around the river did not reveal a subsurface body of magma that could account for the heat. The rock itself fit the broader picture. The region belongs to an old and comparatively stable part of the South American continent, where the crust has experienced little recent volcanic activity. The absence of young volcanic formations, recent eruptions, or a recognizable magmatic reservoir made the conventional explanation increasingly difficult to maintain. Each piece of evidence narrowed the range of possibilities without changing the temperature flowing through the river. An artificial source was considered as well. Industrial activity can introduce heat and chemicals into waterways, so contamination had to be separated from natural geology. The river's remote setting provided an important clue. There was no nearby industrial installation capable of heating such a large volume of moving water, and the thermal pattern extended through the riverbed in a way that followed the natural structure of the channel. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in subtraction. The geology had become a map of absence, and each missing signal carried weight. A shallow magma body could not be found. The water lacked the expected volcanic chemistry. The surrounding crust showed no convincing evidence of a concealed magmatic system. Human infrastructure could not account for the heat. What remained was a geological process in which ordinary groundwater could travel deep into the earth, gather heat, and return through fractures without ever touching molten rock. That possibility changed the scale of the problem. The river did not require an extraordinary source of heat. It required an extraordinary journey for water. Deep circulation could allow groundwater to descend far enough for the normal increase of temperature with depth to become significant. Pressure could keep that water liquid at temperatures that would boil at the surface. Fractured rock could then provide pathways for the heated fluid to rise again. Ruling out a volcano, therefore, left scientists with something more subtle to investigate. The heat had to be traveling through the crust by means of water, rock, pressure, and fractures, all working together across a distance that remained largely inaccessible to direct observation. Rain begins the journey far from the river, falling onto the high Andes before becoming part of a much longer passage through the earth. Some of that water enters fractures in the rock, following openings created by faults and layers of permeable sediment. What looks like an ordinary raindrop on a mountain slope can therefore become part of an underground circulation system that operates across distances measured in miles and timescales measured in centuries or millennia. As the water moves downward, the surrounding rock grows warmer with depth. Earth has a natural geothermal gradient, meaning temperature generally increases as a person travels farther below the surface. The increase is gradual, yet depth provides enough distance for ordinary groundwater to acquire substantial heat. A useful approximation is about 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit for every mile of depth, although the actual gradient varies from one geological setting to another. Several miles underground, the pressure becomes enormous. That pressure changes the behavior of the water. At the surface, temperatures near boiling would cause water to turn into vapor, yet deep underground, the weight of the overlying rock presses down with enough force to keep heated water in a liquid state. The result is a reservoir of compressed fluid, carrying thermal energy gathered during its descent. Then the underground landscape provides an upward route. A fault is more than a crack in stone. It can form a connected pathway through which fluids move between different depths. When hot water encounters such a fracture, pressure can drive it upward. The rising fluid also benefits from its lower density compared with cooler surrounding water and rock, creating a circulation pattern in which heated water ascends while cooler water continues moving downward elsewhere. This process gives the river its remarkable continuity. The water reaching Asháninka has carried heat from depths far below the rainforest, then delivered that energy through openings in the riverbed. Its journey may have begun with precipitation in the Andes hundreds or thousands of years earlier. A portion of the water entering the river today could have started underground before the first Spanish expeditions reached the Amazon. Evidence from other regions shows that such deep circulation is physically possible without a nearby magma chamber. A 2021 study found that groundwater can descend beyond 6 miles and reach temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius or 482 degrees Fahrenheit without direct contact with magma. Those findings provide a useful geological model for understanding how water can become intensely heated while remaining part of a circulating groundwater system. Research published in 2024 from southern Peru added another piece to the regional picture. Investigators documented hot springs aligned with faults at considerable distances from active volcanoes, where rainfall and landscape elevation help drive groundwater downward before heated fluids return toward the surface. These systems suggest that non-volcanic geothermal activity is more broadly distributed across Peru than a map of volcanoes alone would imply. For Asháninka, however, the deepest part of the journey remains out of sight. The precise faults carrying the water have not been mapped through the full subsurface, and the complete route from mountain precipitation to river channel remains uncertain. The rainforest reveals only the final expression of a circulation system whose greater architecture lies inside the rock. Life at the river's edge follows a pattern that becomes visible only when the water is viewed as a collection of temperatures rather than as one continuous stream. Along rocks and sediments, colored films and streaks mark places where microorganisms have established themselves. Green, pink, orange, and blue communities occupy different thermal ranges, creating a living map of conditions that cannot be seen by temperature alone. These organisms belong to a group called thermophiles, meaning heat-loving organisms. They are part of the broader family of extremophiles, life forms adapted to environments that would damage or destroy most ordinary cells. Their survival depends on specialized proteins, membranes, and cellular processes that remain functional when heat would cause familiar biological machinery to break apart. For some of these organisms, the difference between a suitable home and an impossible one can be only a few degrees. A slight change in temperature can alter which species dominate a patch of rock, while a stronger shift can remove a community entirely. The colors therefore carry information. They mark biological boundaries formed by heat, chemistry, mineral availability, and the movement of water across the riverbed. During microbial surveys, scientists used those colors as clues to where life was concentrated. Rosa Vasquez Espinoza, who led a microbial survey in 2019, studied the river's communities across these changing conditions. The work brought attention to organisms living within a thermal landscape that appears hostile from a human perspective, yet provides specialized niches for microscopic life. Their importance extends beyond survival. Microbes adapted to high temperatures can produce molecules with unusual stability, allowing scientists to study biological chemistry under conditions that resemble parts of early Earth or other hot environments. Their enzymes can remain active where many ordinary proteins would lose their structure, making thermophiles valuable subjects in research into how life functions at the limits of temperature. The river also presents an unusual ecological arrangement. The same water that can cause severe injury to larger animals provides habitat for organisms whose cells are built around heat tolerance. A few steps along the bank can therefore separate biological communities with dramatically different requirements. Temperature becomes an ecological boundary, as precise in its effect as a shoreline or change in altitude. Researchers have also found that the microbial communities are shaped by more than heat alone. Minerals dissolved in the water and the availability of chemical energy influence, which organisms can persist in each location. The riverbed becomes a shifting mosaic where water movement, temperature, and chemistry intersect. Each patch contains a different combination of conditions, and each combination favors a different set of microscopic specialists. Some organisms associated with the boiling river appear to have limited known counterparts elsewhere, giving the site unusual scientific value. Claims that every species exists nowhere else require careful testing, since microbial life can be difficult to identify and compare across distant environments. What can be said with greater confidence is that the river contains distinctive communities adapted to a rare combination of heat and chemistry. That makes the water more than a geological curiosity. Within a river capable of overwhelming most forms of life, microscopic organisms have found a narrow range where their own biology works exceptionally well. Their colored traces record that relationship, turning the river itself into a biological thermometer written by life. A curious turn in the story of hot springs came from a place far from the Amazon, where a microbiologist named Thomas Brock began collecting organisms from Yellowstone National Park during the 1960s. The specimens came from waters that seemed inhospitable to ordinary biology. Among them was Thermus aquaticus, a thermophile able to thrive at temperatures above 71 degrees Celsius or 160 degrees Fahrenheit. At the time, organisms living in such conditions were often treated as scientific curiosities, interesting mainly because they challenged familiar ideas about where life could exist. Thermus aquaticus carried something far more useful than an unusual preference for heat. Inside its cells was an enzyme called deoxyribonucleic acid polymerase, a protein capable of copying genetic material while exposed to temperatures that would damage many ordinary enzymes. That stability eventually became the key to polymerase chain reaction, a method that repeatedly copies selected genetic material until a tiny starting sample becomes large enough to examine. The importance of that discovery reaches far beyond specialized laboratories. Polymerase chain reaction became part of modern molecular biology and helped make possible genetic testing, forensic identification, inherited disease screening, genetic ancestry analysis, and many infectious disease tests. During the coronavirus pandemic, the technique became familiar in hospitals and testing centers around the world. A molecule, produced by a heat loving microbe, had become a tool for reading biological information with extraordinary precision. The connection matters when looking back toward the boiling river. Its microorganisms are not identical to the Yellowstone organisms that helped launch this revolution. They exist within a different chemical setting, under different thermal conditions, and with their own evolutionary histories. Some may possess enzymes whose properties have never been examined. Others may produce molecules shaped by the particular minerals and temperatures of this river, creating biochemical possibilities that remain unknown. A microbial survey conducted in 2019 added another layer to the story. Researchers identified communities with unusual genetic characteristics and organisms that had no close match in the reference databases available to them. That does not mean every organism belongs to a completely new branch of life, because microbial diversity is difficult to classify and many species remain poorly sampled. It does mean that the river contains biological material whose chemistry deserves investigation. Only a small fraction of Earth's microbial diversity has been studied in detail. Estimates vary, but even a fraction far below the total has already given science, antibiotics, therapeutic compounds, industrial enzymes, and molecular tools. The history of Thermus aquaticus shows how easily an organism can appear insignificant until someone discovers what its chemistry can do. That possibility gives the boiling river an unusual scientific value. Its microbial communities are not merely inhabitants enduring an extreme environment. They are collections of biological experiments shaped by heat, pressure, minerals, and time. Somewhere among those cells may be proteins that remain stable under unusual conditions, molecules that interact with chemistry in unexpected ways, or enzymes with uses that have not yet been imagined. The river therefore holds two stories at once. Its water records a journey through Earth's underground heat, while its microorganisms record a biological response to that journey. The first story explains why the river can become so hot. The second suggests that the heat itself may have created opportunities for chemistry that science has barely begun to examine. For the Asháninka communities connected to the Mayan-Tuyaku region, the boiling river was never a puzzle waiting for a scientific explanation. It belonged to the landscape they already understood through generations of experience. Its heat, its changing currents, its dangerous banks, and its cooler meeting point with other waters were parts of a living geography passed through memory, practice, and observation. That kind of knowledge develops differently from knowledge recorded in laboratories. A person learns which places can be approached by watching those who came before, then carrying that understanding into the next season. Along the Shenay Timpishka, such experience included recognizing the sections where heat became dangerous, identifying safer ground beside the banks, and knowing where downstream water became suitable for bathing. The river could be read through its behavior long before anyone arrived with a thermometer. The Asháninka relationship with the river also extends beyond temperature. Water from different sections has been incorporated into local practices, including bathing, cooking, and traditional forms of healing. Such uses depend upon an intimate understanding of where water can be handled safely and how its character changes along the river. The knowledge is practical, specific, and connected to the surrounding forest, rather than separated from it. Within this cultural landscape, traditional healers hold an important role in maintaining knowledge about plants, places, seasons, and the relationships between people and their environment. At Mayantuyaku, figures such as Maestro Juan Flores represent a lineage of knowledge in which the river is part of a much larger system of cultural and spiritual understanding. Its importance cannot be reduced to the unusual temperature of the water. The communities associated with the river also became important to modern scientific investigation. When Andres Russo began pursuing the story seriously, reaching the river depended upon relationships with people who already knew the landscape. Scientific instruments could measure temperature and chemistry, yet they could not replace the knowledge required to move through the forest, recognize appropriate routes, or understand which portions of the river could be approached. That distinction matters because discovery can look very different depending on where the story begins. From a laboratory, the boiling river appeared to be an extraordinary geological problem. From within the local communities, it was a known part of the world, observed across generations and incorporated into everyday decisions. The scientific investigation added measurements and geological models to an environment that already had its own accumulated record. Even the safest downstream waters carried information that had been learned through experience. Where the river mixed with cooler water, the character of the flow changed, creating places that could be approached in ways impossible farther upstream. Recognizing those boundaries required attention to currents, temperature, terrain, and season. A map could later record these details, but the knowledge existed first in human memory. This is where indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge meet without needing to become the same thing. Science can measure the temperature of a river, analyze dissolved minerals, and model the movement of groundwater. Generations of local observation can reveal where those measurements matter in practice. One uses instruments and formal models, the other carries information through experience, place, and memory. The Asháninka therefore belong within the story of the boiling river from its beginning, not as witnesses added after its scientific discovery. Their understanding existed before the thermometer arrived, before geological explanations were constructed, and before the river became known beyond its forest home. The instruments confirmed measurements. They did not create the knowledge that the river was there. When the Spanish conquistadors entered the Amazon in the 16th century, they carried expectations shaped by gold, conquest, and maps that barely described the world ahead. What returned with the survivors was a collection of accounts that sounded almost impossible. They spoke of forests so dense that daylight seemed swallowed, warriors carrying poisoned arrows, spiders capable of taking birds, enormous snakes, and water that could boil. Such reports entered the written record during a period when European travelers were encountering animals and natural phenomena that had no place in their familiar understanding. Electric eels, piranhas, and giant anacondas already challenged expectations. A river hot enough to kill animals seemed to belong to the same uncertain category, somewhere between observation and exaggeration. The distinction mattered because the accounts were treated as testimony from men who had endured disease, hunger, violence, and exhausting journeys. Their descriptions could be interpreted as products of fear, exhaustion, or storytelling. Once the boiling river was placed within that category, later readers inherited the judgment without having to revisit the evidence itself. The original story became especially difficult to recover because indigenous knowledge traveled through memory and community rather than European archives, leaving much of that evidence outside the formal records scholars later consulted. People living in the region continued to know the river as a real place with recognizable reaches, hazards, and uses. Their familiarity provided another form of evidence. Yet European scientific culture often assigned greater authority to written observations produced within its own institutions. 4 centuries passed while the world around the river changed at an extraordinary pace. Scientists mapped Mars, developed methods for studying the smallest structures of matter, described the molecular structure of deoxyribonucleic acid, sent human beings to the moon, and eventually learned to read the complete genetic sequence of human beings. Each achievement expanded the boundaries of what could be measured and understood. The river remained outside that expanding circle. The delay reveals something important about how scientific attention works. A phenomenon can exist continuously while remaining scientifically absent if the people who know it are not treated as credible witnesses. Evidence does not become stronger merely because an institution recognizes it. Recognition changes what questions are asked, which observations are recorded, and where resources are directed. The boiling river offers an unusually clear example because its existence was never dependent upon a single modern observation. The river was there when the early accounts were written. It remained there through generations of local knowledge. Its waters continued moving through the forest, while maps, laboratories, and scientific theories changed elsewhere. When modern researchers eventually reached the river and began taking measurements, they were entering a story that had already crossed centuries. The thermometer supplied numbers, geological analysis supplied mechanisms, and microbiology supplied another layer of evidence. Those instruments transformed the river into a scientific subject, yet they did not create the phenomenon they measured. The deeper historical lesson rests in that distinction. A record can survive for centuries and still remain functionally invisible when its source is dismissed. In this case, the cost was more than a mistaken footnote in an old chronicle. It was centuries during which an extraordinary geothermal system remained outside formal investigation, while the people who lived beside it continued to know exactly where the water was. At the river's source, the water gives almost no hint of what lies farther downstream. It moves at 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius, cool enough to drink and ordinary enough to resemble countless other tributaries flowing through the Amazon. Nothing in that first stretch announces the transformation waiting ahead. Then the character of the river changes within a short distance. The boundary between ordinary water and dangerous heat occurs over only a few feet, at the place where fractures beneath the riverbed begin allowing heated groundwater to rise. This sharp transition gives the river a kind of geological punctuation. One moment, the water belongs to the familiar surface world. A short distance later, its temperature belongs to a much deeper part of Earth. A boulder shaped like the head of a serpent stands at this boundary, rising from the current where the temperature begins its climb. For the Asháninka, this stone is more than a convenient landmark. It anchors the Yakumama tradition to a precise location, joining the physical geography of the river with a story carried through generations. The shape of the rock and the behavior of the water meet at the same place, giving the landscape a memory that can be followed with both observation and tradition. Past the Serpent Head boulder, heat accumulates rapidly. The river reaches its greatest measured intensity at La Bamba, where the water has been recorded at 210.4 degrees Fahrenheit, or 99.1 degrees Celsius. At such temperatures, the river approaches the boiling point at ordinary atmospheric pressure. Its behavior reflects the pressure and heat delivered from below, where groundwater emerges through fractures instead of arriving from a single, visible spring. The downstream channel carries another kind of information. Temperature does not decline in one smooth curve. It rises and falls in pulses, with hotter sections appearing where additional geothermal water enters through openings in the riverbed. Between those points, the current loses some heat to the surrounding air and to cooler water. Each fluctuation, therefore, becomes a clue. A sequence of warmer and cooler reaches can reveal the positions of underground pathways that cannot be seen from the surface. The pattern also explains why a single temperature reading can never describe the river completely. The water is a moving record of several underground processes occurring together, with each section preserving a different stage of the journey. Read from source to outlet. Those changes form a natural survey of the hidden plumbing beneath the forest. Farther downstream, the last active discharges fade into the larger flow. Cooler tributaries enter, atmospheric heat escapes from the surface, and the water gradually returns toward temperatures suitable for ordinary contact. Near its meeting with the Pakatea River, the heat has been diluted enough for people to enter the mixing zone. The same river that carried intense geothermal heat now joins a colder system, creating a boundary where two thermal worlds blend. Seen along its entire course, the river becomes more than a single hot stream. Its temperature profile records the movement of water through fractured rock, the locations where heat reaches the surface, and the gradual release of that energy into the Amazon basin. The pattern is written continuously in the water itself, from the cool beginning to La Bamba and onward to the place where the river finally becomes safe enough for people to swim. In 2019, the boiling river became the center of a scientific effort unlike anything that had come before. Biochemist Rosa Vasquez Espinoza led a team of 40 researchers from 7 countries, moving through 19 sampling sites along the river. The work required more than collecting specimens. It required coordination across disciplines, careful movement through difficult terrain, and permission from the people who had protected this place for generations. Vasquez Espinoza brought a personal connection to the landscape. Raised in Peru and trained in chemical biology at the University of Michigan's Life Sciences Institute, she approached the river as both a scientist and a Peruvian returning to study a phenomenon known within her country long before laboratories turned their attention toward it. That perspective shaped the expedition without changing its scientific purpose. Every sample still had to be measured, labeled, preserved, and carried out for analysis. Before the first collection could begin, the researchers needed the approval of Maestro Juan Flores, the shaman of Mayantu Yaku. His permission was an essential part of the expedition itself. Access to the river is controlled by the communities who live there, and without their cooperation, the research could not physically proceed. Scientific investigation, therefore, unfolded within an existing relationship between people and place, with the researchers entering according to rules established by those who knew the river most intimately. The 19 sites were selected to cover the river's changing thermal conditions, beginning near the cooler 21 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit source and extending toward the near boiling water around La Bamba. This arrangement gave the expedition something more valuable than isolated specimens. It created a biological sequence, allowing researchers to compare organisms living at different temperatures and observe how the community changed as the river became hotter. At each location, the team gathered water, sediment, microbial mats from the riverbed, and soil from the banks. Each material contained a different layer of information. Water carried dissolved minerals and living cells. Sediment preserved communities attached to the river's surfaces. Microbial mats revealed organisms growing directly within the thermal gradients, while bank soil provided another environment where heat, moisture, and chemistry interacted. Back in the laboratory, the samples began revealing a biological landscape more unusual than the field observations alone could show. Some microorganisms appeared to have no close relatives represented in existing biological databases. Their genetic and chemical characteristics suggested long adaptation to conditions combining unusual heat with a distinctive mineral environment. The river was therefore becoming a source of biological information as well as geological evidence. The 19 sites also produced a detailed chemical portrait of the river. Measurements of dissolved minerals and other components helped researchers compare one section with another, creating a record that could be used to understand how water changed as it moved through the system. The samples did not provide a finished map of the underground pathways, yet they added constraints that could be tested against geological models. Analysis continued for years after the expedition ended, and the biological inventory remained incomplete into the middle of the 2020s. New organisms could still emerge from material gathered during that single field season. The expedition had transformed one remarkable river into a structured archive, preserving water, sediment, soil, and microbial life from 19 points along its course, each sample carrying a small piece of the river's living record. Around the hottest reaches of the boiling river, the forest changes before the eye has traveled very far. Trees become shorter, the canopy opens, and shrubs occupy spaces that would ordinarily be filled by taller growth. Leaf litter gathers across the ground and dries under the influence of persistent geothermal heat. The boundary is gradual in places, yet its ecological character can be traced with measurements as well as observation. Heat that remains in one location for long periods reshapes the living community around it. Species able to tolerate warmer soil, hotter air near the surface, and repeated drying can persist, while others disappear from the most stressed areas. The result is a simpler forest, with fewer kinds of plants and a corresponding reduction in the insects and birds that depend upon them. The change gives the river an unusual ecological footprint, extending beyond the water itself into the surrounding vegetation. Researchers at the University of Miami, led by doctoral researcher Riley Fortier, examined that footprint using infrared thermography, drone imaging, and temperature sensors placed in the ground. Each method revealed a different part of the same pattern. Infrared images showed where heat accumulated across the landscape. Drone surveys captured changes in canopy structure and vegetation density. Ground sensors recorded temperatures that could be compared with those biological changes over time. Together, these observations revealed a measurable relationship between surface heat anomalies and vegetation loss. The forest closest to the hottest portions of the river experienced thermal conditions strong enough to create a local environment unlike the surrounding rainforest. This made the boiling river something more than an unusual geothermal feature. It became a naturally occurring experiment in how tropical vegetation responds when heat persists without spreading evenly across an entire region. Climate projections provide a useful comparison. The thermal difference recorded around the river falls within the range of warming conditions considered serious for the Amazon during the next 50 years. Research published in Nature Climate Change has projected substantial losses of tree cover and biodiversity when average temperatures rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius or 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Around the boiling river, individual plants and ecological communities are already living through a localized version of that pressure. The surviving species offer another kind of information. They are the plants capable of maintaining growth under conditions that remove many of their neighbors. Their presence can therefore reveal which traits become valuable when heat and dryness persist together. The river is, in effect, filtering the forest in real time, leaving behind species whose physiology gives them greater thermal tolerance. That makes the surrounding vegetation a record written on a smaller scale. A warming climate across the Amazon would unfold across an enormous landscape with countless local differences and uncertain pathways. Here, those pressures are concentrated beside a single river, allowing researchers to study their ecological consequences. The boiling river therefore preserves an unusual glimpse of how tropical forest communities can reorganize when heat becomes a permanent part of the environment. Even the shape of the forest tells part of the story. Where heat is strongest, the canopy loses continuity, and sunlight reaches the ground more readily, reinforcing the drying already imposed by the geothermal source. That feedback can make stressed vegetation increasingly distinct from nearby forest, turning a narrow thermal zone into a visible ecological gradient that can be measured from the ground and from above. When Andres Russo first reached the boiling river in 2011, the landscape still placed a sequence of obstacles between the outside world and the water. The journey required about 2 hours by vehicle, followed by a canoe ride and another hour on foot through dense forest. The river remained separated from ordinary roads by living vegetation, winding waterways, and ground that had to be crossed slowly. 3 years later, that separation had changed. The drive from Pucallpa took about 3 hours, yet the canoe and the hike were no longer necessary. A road had pushed through the forest, carrying vehicles much closer to the river. The missing sections of the journey were evidence in themselves. Trees had been removed from the route, and the forest that once stood between the road and the water had been replaced by access for logging and transport. A road can seem like a narrow line when seen on a map, but its influence spreads outward. Once an opening exists, people, vehicles, equipment, and new roads can follow. Forest edges multiply, sunlight reaches ground that once remained shaded, and the surrounding habitat becomes increasingly divided. For a river whose underground water supply depends on rainfall entering the landscape, the consequences extend beyond the trees. The Amazon loses enormous areas of forest each year, with estimates reaching more than 600,000 hectares, which is about 1.5 million acres, during periods of severe clearing. Each lost patch changes how rain reaches the soil, how water moves through roots and sediment, and how much moisture remains within the local landscape. The underground system beneath the boiling river depends on water entering fractured rock high in the surrounding terrain. Altering that supply over decades could influence the volume of water reaching the geothermal system and potentially the character of the river itself. Protection also has a complicated boundary here. The forests around the boiling river are managed through Asháninka stewardship, yet the surrounding land does not have the same formal status as a national park or another legally protected reserve. Community guardianship can be powerful. Legal protection determines something different, including what happens when commercial pressure reaches the forest edge. Contamination presents another form of risk. Agricultural runoff, fuel, waste, or substances associated with logging could enter streams and soils that eventually connect with the river's wider water system. The microbial communities adapted to its particular combination of heat and chemistry occupy an exceptionally narrow ecological setting. A major chemical change could remove organisms that took immense spans of geological time to evolve. That vulnerability gives the forest around the river an unusual importance. Trees protect soil, regulate infiltration, and help preserve the pathways through which rainfall becomes groundwater. The forest is therefore part of the river's physical system, even when its roots never touch the boiling water. The microbes face an even more final constraint, one that cannot be solved by relocation. Their evolutionary history cannot be moved elsewhere like a seed collection or rebuilt from a second population. If a unique community disappears from the boiling river, its particular combination of organisms and chemistry disappears with it. It marks the arrival of a pressure that can alter the landscape, feeding the river, and, with it, one of Earth's rarest living systems. After the first journey to the boiling river, Andres Russo faced a choice that often arrives after discovery. A scientist can document an extraordinary place, publish the findings, and return to the next unanswered problem. Russo chose to remain connected to the river itself. The decision became the foundation of the Boiling River Project, a nonprofit created to understand and protect the river, its surrounding forest, and the communities whose lives are tied to it. The project brought conservation and research into the same landscape. Scientific teams could continue examining the geology, water chemistry, biology, and geothermal processes, while conservation efforts worked toward stronger legal recognition for the site. The organization also placed Asháninka communities at the center of that work. Their participation shaped decisions about access, research, education, and conservation priorities from the beginning. Their authority over access, their knowledge of the river, and their long relationship with the surrounding forest were treated as part of the foundation for research rather than as background material added after the scientific work was finished. That approach changes the meaning of collaboration. A researcher arriving with instruments carries one kind of knowledge built from measurements, samples, and models. A community living beside the same river carries another, formed through repeated observation across generations. The two forms can meet without one needing to erase the other. Temperature readings can describe physical conditions, while local knowledge can identify safe routes, seasonal changes, medicinal plants, and places whose significance cannot be understood from a water sample alone. National Geographic grants helped give the project institutional support, allowing research and conservation work to continue while the surrounding forest remained vulnerable to development. The project has pursued a broader case for protecting the site under Peruvian law, presenting the river as a place with scientific, cultural, and ecological value that cannot be recreated elsewhere. Its significance reaches beyond the water itself, extending into the underground system that produces the heat, the forest that feeds the water cycle, and the microbial communities adapted to the river's unusual chemistry. The importance of that work received wider recognition in 2024, when Russo became one of the recipients of the Lowell Thomas Award from the Explorers Club. The honor recognized his work as a geothermal scientist and conservationist, placing the boiling river within a larger history of exploration and environmental stewardship. For Russo, the central lesson is larger than the discovery of an unusual geothermal river. The Asháninka already possessed knowledge of the place before instruments arrived, and the river had meaning before scientific terminology was applied to it. Research added measurements, maps, chemical analyses, and geological models. Those tools expanded what could be demonstrated, while the community's knowledge helped determine where and how that work could occur. The Boiling River Project therefore rests on a practical idea. Protecting the river requires protecting the relationships that make its study possible. Scientific investigation can document what the geothermal system does, while indigenous stewardship can help preserve the landscape in which that system exists. Neither can relocate the river if it is destroyed, and neither can reconstruct its living communities once they are gone. The project turns that shared limitation into a reason for cooperation, giving scientific evidence and indigenous authority a common place in the effort to keep the river intact. When the international research team arrived in 2019, its scientific map was already crowded with information. 40 researchers from 7 countries carried equipment, records, and a sampling plan covering 19 locations along the river. Temperature measurements, satellite images, and earlier field observations had helped determine where samples would be collected. The plan was careful, systematic, and designed to capture the river's changing conditions. Maestro Juan Flores looked at that map from another position, one shaped by decades of watching the water and the forest around it. He knew places that did not stand out in the scientific data. A particular bank behaved differently during the dry season. A section of riverbed could alter the color of the water. Certain plants appeared in places where they were absent only a short distance away. These details were part of his working knowledge of the river, even though they had never been translated into coordinates or measurements. Flores suggested additional sampling locations outside the original plan. His recommendations were grounded in observation accumulated across years of returning to the same places under changing conditions. A thermometer could record the temperature where it was placed, while a satellite could reveal patterns visible from above. Neither could describe a location that had never been examined with those tools. His observations pointed the researchers toward parts of the river that their instruments had not yet learned to recognize as significant. Samples collected from some of those added locations produced microbial communities of particular scientific interest. Organisms were found living within small thermal and chemical environments that could have remained outside the survey if the original map had been followed without modification. The significance was practical. Indigenous observation changed where the researchers looked, and changing where they looked changed what they were able to collect and study. That distinction matters because the contribution was more than a collection of stories about the river. Flores supplied information that affected the design of fieldwork itself. His knowledge helped identify places worthy of measurement before measurements existed there. Once scientists sampled those locations, the resulting biological evidence could enter laboratories, databases, and formal research. Observation became a bridge between generations of experience and modern scientific analysis. The episode also reveals the unusual scale of Asháninka knowledge. A scientific expedition may spend days or weeks examining a river, returning with instruments and samples that preserve a detailed record of particular conditions. A community living beside the same water can accumulate observations across seasons, floods, droughts, changes in vegetation, animal behavior, and countless ordinary journeys along the banks. That record is distributed across memory and practice instead of stored in a single machine. For the boiling river, this difference has practical consequences. The landscape contains small changes that can disappear between widely spaced sampling points, while a person who knows the river intimately may recognize them from color, plants, flow, or seasonal behavior. Formal science can test such observations once they are brought into the research process. Indigenous knowledge can help decide which observations deserve testing in the first place. The samples associated with Flores's recommendations, therefore, carry a meaning larger than their contents. They show that knowledge, gathered through long familiarity with a place, can alter the path of scientific investigation itself. In this river, the map was expanded by a person whose first instrument had always been sustained attention. There is a particular kind of knowledge that survives because it is carried from one generation to another in stories. Along the boiling river, the story of Yakamama, the mother of the waters, preserves an account of how heat and cold belong to the same living system. The serpent is said to dwell beneath the river, shaping its waters and governing the different conditions found along its course. Seen through geology, the pattern becomes strikingly concrete. Heated water rises through fractures in the rocks below the riverbed, entering the channel where the underground pathways reach the surface. From there, the water travels downstream through a section that remains intensely hot before losing heat through mixing and contact with cooler water. Eventually, the river meets the cold Pakitia River, creating a meeting place where two very different temperatures exist within the same connected system. The old story places these conditions under the authority of one serpent. Hot water belongs to the creature, and cold water belongs to it as well. The geological picture carries the same relationship in physical form. A single underground system supplies heated water, while downstream mixing produces the colder environment. The distinction is not a poetic resemblance added afterward, it follows the geography of the river itself. Even the serpent's head has a physical counterpart. At the river's source, a boulder shaped like the head of a serpent marks the place where the water changes from ordinary to dangerously hot. Its position matters because the temperature transition occurs where heated water begins emerging through the fractured ground. A landmark remembered through tradition, therefore, sits at the edge of a measurable geological boundary. The story also carries practical knowledge. Reverence toward Yakumama and caution around the hottest sections would have encouraged people to recognize those places as dangerous. In a river where heat can become lethal over a short distance, such guidance could protect travelers, fishers, and families without requiring written instructions or measuring devices. The legend preserved a rule for living beside the water, while also preserving the geography that gave the rule meaning. That makes Yakumama more than a symbolic explanation of an unusual river. The story contains observations about where the river changes, how its waters relate to one another, and which places demand caution. Those observations could pass through generations without maps, thermometers, laboratories, or formal scientific institutions. Each retelling carried a compact record of a landscape that remained available for comparison whenever people returned to the same places. When modern measurements entered that landscape, they supplied numbers to observations that had already endured through memory. The thermometer used by Andres Russo in 2011 measured the river's extraordinary heat, while the geography of the river continued to correspond with the older account. The instrument added precision to the record. It did not erase the knowledge that came before it. Yakumama therefore occupies an unusual place between story and science. Its serpent belongs to the cultural world of the Asháninka, while the river's heat, fractures, mixing zones, and changing temperatures belong to geophysics. Yet the two records meet at specific locations and physical behavior. The legend had preserved a relationship within the landscape long before scientific instruments could describe it in numerical terms. The enduring value lies in that correspondence, where memory, place, and measurable natural processes remain connected across centuries of observation and change. A sample of river water can carry a history far older than the moment when it reaches a scientist's hand. Dissolved minerals, gases, and tiny variations in the atoms that make up water preserve clues about the places that water has visited. At the boiling river, those clues form a chemical record of a journey that begins somewhere in the high country, passes through rock, gathers heat, and eventually returns to the surface. The most useful clues come from isotopes, natural forms of the same element that contain different numbers of neutrons. Water containing slightly heavier forms of hydrogen and oxygen behaves differently from water carrying lighter forms, and their proportions can vary with elevation, temperature, and the history of precipitation. Rain and snow, formed under colder conditions, often carry a different isotopic signature from precipitation falling in warmer lowlands. When those signatures are measured in river water, they can help identify the environment where the water originally entered the ground. Early isotope work on the boiling river has supported the idea that its water may have an Andean connection. That possibility fits the larger geological picture in which precipitation enters the ground at higher elevations, moves downward through fractures and permeable rocks, absorbs heat, and eventually returns through faults beneath the Amazonian lowlands. The isotope record cannot yet draw the entire route on a map, though it provides another independent line of evidence for the circulation system. Silica offers a different kind of clue. Hot water can dissolve more silica from surrounding rock than cooler water, allowing the concentration carried to the surface to preserve information about the conditions encountered underground. A high silica concentration can therefore place limits on the temperature the water experienced before returning upward. The river becomes a moving sample of the rocks through which it traveled, carrying dissolved material from places no researcher can directly see. Other dissolved elements add further detail. Calcium, magnesium, iron, and trace metals can reflect interactions between heated water and particular minerals in the surrounding formations. Their combined pattern can be compared with the known geology of the region, narrowing the range of possible underground pathways. Each chemical component becomes another small mark in a record assembled without a visible road, tunnel, or channel. There is still an important boundary around what the measurements can tell us. The complete underground route has not been traced from recharge area to emergence point, and the precise residence time of the water remains unresolved. Scientists can infer parts of the system from chemistry and geology, yet inference is different from watching the water make its journey. That uncertainty gives the river an unusual scientific character. Isotope measurements can also be paired with other methods, including elemental chemistry and geological mapping, so that one clue can test another. When several independent signals point toward the same interpretation, confidence grows, even when the deepest parts of the pathway remain beyond direct observation. The water reaching the surface today carries evidence of its passage through an underground world that cannot be observed directly. Its isotopes preserve information about origin, its silica records, heat and rock interaction, and its dissolved minerals reflect the geological terrain along the way. Taken together, these signatures form an autobiography written in chemistry, with several pages legible and many others still waiting to be read. The river reveals only the smallest visible part of the system that feeds it. Beneath the forest floor, fractures in the earth can extend far beyond the channel, creating pathways through which groundwater descends, gathers heat, dissolves minerals, and rises again. The Asháninka is therefore better understood as a surface window into a geological structure whose boundaries cannot be seen from the riverbank. Thermal surveys have offered glimpses of what may lie beyond that window. Aerial and satellite observations around the Mayantiyacu region have identified patches of ground warmer than the surrounding forest. Some appear in patterns that can be consistent with geothermal discharge, although a thermal anomaly alone cannot establish its cause. Even so, repeated anomalies create places worth investigating, especially where geothermal activity can occur far from a volcano. The distinction matters when interpreting patterns seen from above. That possibility matters because the Amazon is not generally associated with the kind of geothermal landscape people imagine around volcanic regions. A warm spring appearing deep inside tropical forest can emerge from entirely different geological circumstances. Water may travel through fractures toward heated rock at depth, then return upward along faults that provide a path of lower resistance. If another spring reaches roughly 55 degrees Celsius or 131 degrees Fahrenheit, it would represent a significant geological feature in a region where such systems remain poorly documented. Research published in 2024 on hydrothermal systems in southern Peru added broader context. Investigations identified hot springs aligned with faults at substantial distances from active volcanoes, supporting the existence of non-volcanic geothermal systems across parts of the region. The pattern places the boiling river within a setting where deep circulation through fractured rock is plausible. Tracing that network would require tools capable of seeing far below the surface. Deep seismic imaging could reveal structures within the crust by measuring how waves travel through different materials. Drilling could provide direct samples of rock, fluids, and temperature at depth. Such work would demand major funding, extensive logistics, and careful agreements over land access, particularly where indigenous territories and areas affected by logging overlap with the scientific region. None of that large-scale mapping has yet produced a complete picture of the system. The uncertainty leaves an unusual imbalance. The surface of the Amazon has been photographed from orbit, crossed by roads and rivers, cataloged by biologists, and examined from aircraft. Its deeper architecture remains far less familiar. Centuries of local observation established that something unusual existed around the boiling river, while modern instruments eventually revealed pieces of the physical system beneath it. Thermal imaging now offers another layer of possibility, showing that the river may belong to a wider family of geothermal expressions scattered through the forest. A warm patch may become a spring, a fracture zone, or an ordinary variation in the forest surface. Yet the possibility of undiscovered geothermal features remains significant because the same forces that bring heated water to the boiling river do not recognize the boundaries of a river channel. They follow rock, pressure, and fractures deep below the green canopy, where the Amazon's geology continues beyond what the eye can reach. Four different kinds of knowledge meet along the same stretch of water, each revealing a different layer of the place. Geothermal science follows the movement of heated groundwater through fractured rock. Microbiology follows organisms adapted to unusual combinations of heat and chemistry. Climate research follows what sustained warmth does to a tropical forest. Indigenous knowledge follows generations of seasonal changes, biological patterns, and places where the river behaves differently. Together, these disciplines create a research setting that is difficult to reproduce anywhere else. For geothermal scientists, the river is an unusually large, non-volcanic hydrothermal system. Its surface behavior can be observed directly, while much of the structure responsible for that behavior remains below reach. Measurements of temperature, minerals, water chemistry, and underground circulation gradually narrow the possible explanations. Each expedition adds another piece to that geological picture, allowing researchers to compare observations with models of how heated water moves through the crust. The biological side carries a different kind of uncertainty. Samples collected during the 2019 expedition continue to reveal organisms adapted to thermal and chemical conditions that would exclude many ordinary rainforest species. Some may represent previously undescribed forms of life. Their enzymes and other compounds could also provide clues about how living systems function under prolonged heat stress. The value of those samples extends beyond their names. Each organism records a long history of adaptation within a particular environment, and that record disappears if the environment disappears. The forest itself forms a third laboratory. Vegetation growing near the hottest portions of the river has experienced sustained thermal stress while remaining embedded within a tropical ecosystem. That makes the surrounding forest valuable for climate research because scientists can examine biological responses under real conditions instead of relying entirely on controlled experiments or projections. Changes in tree stature, canopy structure, leaf litter, and species composition provide several measures of how persistent heat can reshape a rainforest community. Then there is the knowledge carried by the Asháninka. Their observations connect seasons, plants, animals, water behavior, and locations along the river through generations of direct experience. Scientific instruments can record a temperature at a particular moment. A community living with the river can recognize patterns that unfold across years, decades, and family histories. Those forms of observation complement one another, creating a fuller record than either could provide alone. The four fields are also tied together by dependencies that make the river especially valuable. Geothermal conditions shape the water chemistry that supports its microbial communities. The forest must remain intact for the climate record to retain meaning. The indigenous record depends on the continued presence of the community and its relationship with the river. Damage to one layer can therefore weaken several areas of research at once. That convergence gives the river a value measured in more than scientific findings. It also changes how the loss of the site would be understood. Losing one feature would remove a physical setting, while losing the whole system would erase connections between several independent lines of evidence. It is a living platform where geology, biology, climate, and human observation can be studied together within the same connected system. Yet this rare combination exists outside a formally protected area, leaving an unusually important collection of scientific records exposed to changes in the landscape around it. The connection begins with a basic condition shared by Earth and the icy moons. Life can draw energy from chemistry, even where sunlight never reaches. Europa, circling Jupiter, and Enceladus, circling Saturn, are considered among the most promising ocean worlds for the search for life. Each possesses a global ocean beneath an outer shell of ice, with internal heating helping keep water liquid. That makes their darkness less important than the chemistry occurring where water meets rock. Europa is especially interesting because its ocean may rest against a rocky seafloor. If water circulates through that rock and returns carrying heat and dissolved minerals, hydrothermal activity could provide an energy source for organisms living far below the ice. The process would resemble the fundamental exchange studied in terrestrial hydrothermal systems, where water moves through rock, acquires chemical energy, and emerges into a different environment. Evidence for active vents on Europa remains indirect, so scientists treat the possibility as a working hypothesis rather than an established observation. Enceladus offers a closer connection to actual measurements. The Cassini spacecraft detected material escaping from fractures near the Moon's south pole, including water vapor, organic compounds, and other chemical constituents. Analyses of the plume have also provided evidence that water interacts with rock inside the Moon, supporting the presence of hydrothermal activity beneath its ocean. The spacecraft effectively sampled material from an environment no instrument could reach directly. Those findings have made Enceladus one of the most compelling places to investigate how water, rock, heat, and chemistry might create conditions suitable for life. This is where the boiling river becomes useful. Its organisms live within a terrestrial system where heat and mineral chemistry shape the biological community without relying on sunlight as the immediate energy source. Studying how these microbes tolerate thermal stress, obtain energy, and interact with their surroundings gives astrobiologists a living reference for the kinds of strategies life might use in other chemically powered environments. The comparison is about processes, chemistry, and biological limits rather than identical environments. Rosa Vasquez Espinoza has described the river's extremophile community in connection with astrobiology, linking the study of life in extreme terrestrial settings with the search for life beyond Earth. The value lies in having organisms that can be observed, analyzed, and placed within a known geological setting. Scientists can examine their metabolism and cellular adaptations, then use those observations when considering what forms of biology could persist where sunlight is absent and chemical energy dominates. That work also changes what scientists mean by a habitable environment. A world does not need a warm surface, open sky, or steady sunlight to provide ingredients for biology. Liquid water, reactive minerals, energy gradients, and enough chemical stability may be sufficient to create niches where organisms can persist. The river offers a place to examine those ingredients together with living cells available for direct study. The river therefore becomes part of a much larger scientific conversation. A microbial community beside a tropical river can inform ideas about organisms beneath kilometers of ice on another world, even though the environments themselves are profoundly different. Each adaptation observed here provides evidence about the range of conditions life can tolerate. In that sense, the boiling river is more than an extreme ecosystem. It is a terrestrial laboratory for imagining biology in places where the sky is frozen, sunlight is absent, and the energy for living may rise from the rock below. The distance between the first written reports of the boiling river and its scientific investigation can be measured in centuries. But the consequences of that distance are easier to see through what never entered a laboratory. Spanish colonial accounts from the 16th century described a river in the Peruvian Amazon with water hot enough to kill animals and people. The reports contained geographical clues and observations that later allowed investigators to identify the place. Alongside those written records, Asháninka communities preserved their own knowledge of the river through generations of direct observation. For centuries, these two forms of evidence existed side by side without becoming part of the same scientific record. The colonial descriptions were treated as extraordinary travel testimony, while indigenous knowledge was rarely given a recognized place within formal scientific institutions. That distinction mattered because scientific attention follows sources judged worthy of verification. The river remained known to people who lived within its landscape, while formal investigation waited until 2011, when Andres Russo began measuring its temperature and documenting its physical characteristics. The interval was roughly 400 years. During that span, the river could have provided a natural laboratory for geothermal research, microbial ecology, and the study of vegetation exposed to persistent heat. The microbial cost is especially difficult to measure because discoveries that were never made leave no catalog behind. Every organism that might have been collected earlier, every unusual enzyme that might have been studied, and every chemical compound that might have been tested exists only as a possibility. Yet the logic of such possibilities is grounded in established scientific history. In Yellowstone, thermophilic organisms became important to molecular biology after scientists began studying them during the 20th century. Their enzymes eventually supported laboratory techniques that transformed genetic research. The boiling river's organisms may contain useful chemistry of their own, although the applications remain unknown. A similar lesson emerged through ethnobotany, a field that examines relationships between people and plants. Researchers learned that indigenous communities could identify medicinally useful species through accumulated experience, guiding scientific investigation toward compounds that might otherwise have taken longer to locate. Knowledge became a starting point for research rather than an obstacle to it. The value of this approach was practical. It could narrow the search for useful chemistry across an enormous biological landscape. The boiling river presents a particularly clear chronology. A phenomenon was recorded during the 16th century. Indigenous knowledge continued across generations. Formal scientific measurement arrived in 2011. Between those points lies approximately 400 years during which geothermal conditions went unmeasured, microbial communities went unsampled, and the river's heat-stressed vegetation went without a scientific baseline. That absence cannot be converted into a precise number of lost discoveries. Science cannot calculate experiments that were never performed or compounds that were never isolated. It can, however, identify the opportunities that remained outside the record. The river offers an unusually precise case because its chronology can be traced from early written accounts to modern measurement. It also shows that evidence can remain available for centuries, while the questions needed to interpret it are never asked. The delay, therefore, belongs partly to the history of scientific judgment itself. Its history shows how the choice of which evidence deserves investigation can shape what science knows and how long it takes to know it. A river can appear timeless when measured against a human lifetime, yet its foundations belong to a chronology so deep that the present forest becomes only a recent layer. The rocks beneath the Amazon basin preserve a history reaching back billions of years. Within that old continental framework, fractures and faults have opened, shifted, and been reshaped through immense intervals of tectonic change. The pathways carrying heated water toward the surface belong to that larger geological story. The oldest exposed rocks associated with the Amazon craton are more than 3 billion years old. They formed when Earth itself was still taking shape into the continental architecture recognized today. Much later, tectonic forces altered the margins and interior of the continent, creating folds, fractures, and fault zones capable of guiding fluids through the crust. The system beneath the boiling river, therefore, rests upon architecture vastly older than the rainforest that now surrounds it. The Amazon rainforest, as a recognizable tropical ecosystem, emerged much later. Its history reaches back tens of millions of years, with the modern forest shaped through changing climates, landscapes, and connections between the Andes and the lowlands. When those forests began occupying the region, the underlying rocks and much of their structural history were already present. Trees grew above a geological inheritance they did not create, while water continued moving through pathways formed by processes far older than any human memory. Dating the boiling river itself is more difficult. A fault does not preserve one permanent shape, and hydrothermal circulation can shift as fractures open, close, erode, or become redirected. The present arrangement of heated springs and channels may therefore be relatively young compared with the rocks carrying them. Even so, the geological conditions that permit deep water circulation belong to a history extending far beyond the appearance of people in South America. Some of the water reaching the surface may also have spent a very long period moving through the underground system. Groundwater can descend through permeable rock, travel along fractures, absorb heat, and return upward after following complicated pathways. The precise age of the water emerging at any particular spring remains difficult to establish, so its journey should be described with care. What can be said is that the process operates on timescales capable of reaching far beyond recorded human history. That contrast gives the present landscape an unusual perspective. Geological structures can persist through climatic cycles, shifting river courses, and changes in the living world above them. Human settlements and civilizations occupy only a thin interval within that record. Logging operates on an entirely different clock. A road can enter a forest within years. Vegetation can be removed within seasons, and drainage patterns can change during a single generation. For a system shaped through geological time, such speed has little precedent. The rocks can endure enormous changes, yet the ecological setting surrounding a geothermal feature can be altered rapidly. The river's deep history, therefore, makes the current threat more distinct. Its surrounding forest is a recent biological expression resting upon a much older geological foundation, and that foundation cannot protect the ecosystem above it from rapid human change. What took geological processes immense spans of time to establish can be exposed to human disturbance within a fraction of one lifetime, leaving an ancient system vulnerable to changes that arrive with extraordinary speed. The future of the boiling river is being shaped in places far removed from its steaming channels. A document can move through a ministry office. A conservation proposal can wait for review, and a decision about land can alter the conditions around the river before the change is visible from the water. In that sense, conservation is already part of the river's physical story, because the forest around it helps determine what reaches the springs and channels below. The scientific evidence has accumulated. The indigenous stewardship claim has a living community behind it, and Peruvian law contains mechanisms that can recognize protected places. What remains unsettled is whether those pieces will be brought together in time. The Shanay Timpishka currently lies outside a formally designated protected area under Peru's national system. That leaves the Asháninka community carrying much of the practical responsibility for protecting the river and its surrounding forest. Stewardship can guide visitors, restrict harmful activity, and preserve knowledge. Yet, community authority does not automatically provide the same legal enforcement available within a formally protected area. The distinction becomes important when outside economic interests reach the watershed. Legal recognition could give that protection a durable institutional foundation. And those interests have not disappeared. Logging pressure has continued in the surrounding region, while roads can open access to forest that previously required difficult travel. Fire adds another pathway of disturbance. During severe Amazonian fire seasons, burned areas can approach regions surrounding Mayantuyacu, placing additional stress on vegetation and soils that help regulate the river's watershed. Each pressure operates at the surface, while the geothermal system depends on the integrity of the landscape above and around it. There is another possibility that makes the decision more complicated. Heat itself can be treated as a resource. A geothermal system capable of producing naturally heated water invites the idea of commercial energy development, even though exploiting that energy would require roads, equipment, drilling, pipelines, or other infrastructure. Any such intervention would change the physical setting that makes the river scientifically valuable. The same heat that draws scientific attention could therefore become an economic argument for altering the site. For Andres Rousseau and the Boiling River Project, scientific documentation forms part of a longer effort to establish why the river deserves formal protection. Temperature measurements, geological studies, biodiversity surveys, and research into the surrounding ecosystem can transform an extraordinary place into a documented conservation case. Consultation with the Asháninka community also matters because protection cannot be separated from the people whose knowledge and stewardship have persisted across generations. The decision is therefore larger than a single designation on a government map. It concerns whether the river will be treated as a resource to extract from, a landscape to manage, or a scientific and cultural site whose value depends upon keeping its surrounding systems intact. Those choices are being shaped through government offices, conservation discussions, community decisions, and economic calculations occurring now. Nothing in that process guarantees one outcome. The scientific record can establish significance, and community stewardship can preserve a remarkable continuity of knowledge, yet formal protection still depends upon institutions choosing to act. The boiling river remains in that unsettled space, where its future is no longer determined by geology alone. Human decisions have entered the river's timeline, and the next chapter is being written in the present. At the edge of the boiling river, temperature becomes more than a number. It becomes a boundary that can be sensed through the behavior of living things. Most familiar life occupies a surprisingly restricted thermal range. Water remains liquid, proteins retain functional shapes, and the chemical reactions inside cells can proceed within limits that seem broad from an ordinary human perspective. Seen beside this river, those limits begin to look remarkably precise. At 32 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0 degrees Celsius, liquid water freezes, changing the physical environment available to most organisms. Farther upward, heat places increasing stress on the molecular machinery of cells. Around 130 degrees Fahrenheit, or 54 degrees Celsius, many proteins begin losing their carefully folded structures, although the exact threshold varies among organisms and individual proteins. Once those structures fail, the reactions they control can no longer proceed normally. For plants, animals, fungi, and most familiar microorganisms, the usable range is therefore bounded by several interacting physical and chemical constraints. The river occupies a different part of that spectrum. Its average temperature has been reported at about 186 degrees Fahrenheit, or 86 degrees Celsius, with the hottest measured areas reaching about 210 degrees Fahrenheit, or 99 degrees Celsius. These conditions lie far beyond the range tolerated by complex organisms such as fish, mammals, trees, and most other life visible to the human eye. The heat also changes how minerals dissolve, how gases behave, and which chemical reactions remain energetically useful. Still, the water supports organisms adapted to those conditions. Thermophiles have molecular structures and cellular chemistry suited to temperatures that would damage the proteins of ordinary organisms. Some obtain energy through chemical reactions involving minerals and compounds in their surroundings, allowing them to build lives without depending directly on sunlight. Their existence shifts the meaning of an environmental limit. A temperature that closes one biological world can form the center of another. This distinction matters because adaptation does not erase physical constraints. Each organism occupies a range shaped by the stability of its proteins, membranes, genetic material, and energy-producing reactions. The range can move when evolution changes those structures, but it remains bounded. Thermophiles, therefore, do not show that life can flourish under any condition. They show that the boundaries themselves can differ between lineages, sometimes by an extraordinary amount. The river offers a rare view of that difference within one landscape, because neighboring water can carry sharply different biological possibilities within a short distance. Cooler water nearby can support organisms adapted to ordinary tropical conditions, while hotter zones select for communities with very different cellular machinery. Temperature becomes a filter, separating forms of life according to the chemistry their bodies can sustain. The transition is gradual across the river, yet its biological consequences can be profound. From a human scale, the familiar thermal window feels like the natural setting for life because every human experience begins inside it. The boiling river places another possibility beside that assumption. Life has no single temperature, no universal setting that applies equally to every organism. There are many windows, each shaped by chemistry, energy, pressure, and evolutionary history. The one surrounding us is simply the window through which our own kind of life learned to exist, and the river makes that familiar interval visible as one possibility among many. Science has a habit of becoming most comfortable with things that already fit its vocabulary. A claim can remain outside that vocabulary for generations, even when people continue describing the same phenomenon in different places and different eras. The boiling river belongs to this older pattern of uncertainty, where testimony is placed at a distance from evidence until someone decides that the testimony deserves to be tested. The history of the giant squid offers a striking parallel. Sailors had described enormous tentacled creatures for centuries, sometimes linking them with ships and deep water. Such accounts were easy to treat as maritime exaggeration because the animals seemed to belong more naturally to folklore than natural history. Then, in 1878, a giant squid specimen washed ashore in Newfoundland. Its body gave naturalists something that stories alone could not provide: a physical object that could be measured, examined, and placed within scientific classification. The creature had existed throughout the period of disbelief. Only its status in human knowledge had changed. Ball lightning followed a different path. Reports of glowing spheres appearing during thunderstorms accumulated across centuries, yet the phenomenon remained difficult to reproduce or capture under controlled conditions. In 2012, researchers in China recorded a luminous event associated with a thunderstorm and analyzed its light spectroscopically, providing unusually strong physical evidence for a phenomenon that had long occupied the border between observation and uncertainty. The recording did not make every historical account correct. It showed that an unusual atmospheric event could exist behind a category that had often been treated with skepticism. The boiling river carries the same structure into a tropical landscape. Spanish accounts described water hot enough to kill, while Asháninka knowledge preserved detailed awareness of the river and its changing conditions. For generations, neither source was given the scientific weight that would have prompted sustained investigation. The river remained easier to classify as legend, exaggeration, or misunderstanding than as a geological system awaiting measurement. That distinction matters because dismissal can happen before evidence is examined. A report from a sailor, an indigenous community, a traveler, or a farmer may be judged according to the identity of the person giving it, rather than the possibility contained within the observation. Once credibility becomes a gate through which evidence must pass, entire subjects can remain outside scientific attention without receiving the experiment that might resolve them. There is a strange limitation in asking what is being dismissed today. We cannot easily identify every case from inside the same process because a claim still waiting for investigation can look indistinguishable from a claim that will eventually prove false. Some stories are mistaken. Some observations are distorted. Others may describe phenomena that science has not yet measured well enough to understand. Distinguishing among them requires curiosity, disciplined testing, patience, and a willingness to examine evidence before deciding what category it belongs to. The useful lesson is therefore less about believing every extraordinary account and more about preserving the path from testimony to testing. The boiling river shows what happens when that path remains closed for centuries. 400 years became a period during which observations accumulated while investigation did not. Somewhere beyond the boundaries of established knowledge, other observations may be waiting for the same first step, not acceptance, but the chance to be measured. A river can be dangerous without possessing anything that resembles danger. Its heat has no intention behind it, no awareness of the bodies that enter its flow. Water moves through channels shaped by gravity, carrying energy upward from deeper rock, and the physical consequences follow from temperature alone. A fish does not need to be attacked for its proteins to fail. A mammal does not need to be hunted for its cells to lose their structure. The river remains what it is, while life encounters the limits of its own chemistry. That quality separates the boiling river from the dangers people usually imagine. A predator responds to movement. A disease enters a body and alters its functions. A storm gathers, travels, and changes the landscape around it. Heat requires none of these behaviors. It does not pursue, choose, or resist. At the river's elevated temperature, molecular motion simply becomes too intense for the biological machinery of most familiar organisms to remain stable. The boundary is physical, indifferent, and remarkably consistent. For the thermophiles, however, the same water belongs to another category entirely. Their proteins, membranes, and cellular processes have evolved to function under conditions that would dismantle the chemistry of most other organisms. The minerals dissolved in the water become part of their surroundings. Chemical energy replaces sunlight as the foundation of their existence. Their world is shaped around a range of conditions that appears extraordinary only when measured against our own biological limits. That reversal changes the meaning of extremity. A forest animal entering the river encounters a place outside its workable range. A heat-adapted microbe entering cooler forest water may face an equally unsuitable environment, even though the temperature feels ordinary to us. The same principle extends through the living world. Salt concentrations, acidity, pressure, radiation, oxygen availability, and temperature all define different boundaries for different forms of life. There is no single setting that biology recognizes as universally comfortable. Even the word extreme carries a human reference point. We call an environment extreme when it departs sharply from the conditions under which organisms familiar to us can function. The thermophiles expose the narrowness of that assumption. Their existence does not erase the limits imposed by chemistry. It shows that life can occupy different positions within those limits when evolution has enough time to reshape the machinery of cells. That perspective also changes how absence should be interpreted. A place that seems empty to human senses may contain organisms whose requirements are so different that ordinary signs of life become irrelevant. What looks barren from one biological viewpoint can be densely inhabited from another. The river therefore offers something more precise than a lesson about survival. It provides a glimpse of how relative habitability can be. A temperature that ends the life of one organism can sustain another. A chemical mixture that seems inhospitable may contain exactly the resources a specialized community needs. The boundary between home and hazard moves with the organism observing it. Seen this way, the river has no absolute edge of habitability. It has overlapping biological worlds, each governed by its own tolerances. The jungle and the heated channel meet within the same landscape, yet they represent profoundly different conditions for life. Somewhere in that contrast is a larger possibility that life beyond Earth may occupy environments that appear impossible only because our own biology gives us a limited reference point. The river's future contains an unusual division. Deep below the surface, rock continues its work according to forces that began long before people placed names on this part of the Amazon. Heat rises through fractures, groundwater moves through stone, and the geological machinery beneath the forest follows its own rhythm. The process does not depend on a government decision, a conservation plan, or the existence of a road. Some of the water emerging at La Bamba may have spent thousands of years moving through the earth before returning to the surface. Its journey belongs to a timescale that reaches beyond the history of states and languages. The river's heat has persisted through changes in climate, the arrival of human communities, the growth of empires, and the transformations that followed European contact. Geological persistence gives the river a kind of continuity that human history rarely possesses. The living world surrounding that heat has a different story. Microorganisms adapted to the river's chemistry occupy narrow habitats where temperature and dissolved minerals create particular conditions for growth. Vegetation near the channel exists under sustained thermal stress, forming a biological boundary that can change when the surrounding forest is disturbed. Farther downstream, cooler water creates mixing zones where other organisms and human communities can use the river in ways that would be impossible at its hottest points. That distinction matters because the underground system can remain active while the ecosystem built around it changes beyond recognition. A fault can continue carrying heated water even after trees have been removed from the watershed. The geothermal process may persist through erosion, altered drainage, and human construction. What can disappear much faster is the living arrangement that has developed around the heat, along with the relationships that connect the river to the forest and to the people who know its seasonal patterns. Scientific knowledge has its own form of fragility. A microbial sample can be preserved, a temperature can be recorded, and a geological measurement can be stored in an archive. Some observations can therefore survive physical disturbance. The larger body of knowledge cannot be reduced to specimens and numbers. It includes where organisms occur, how the water changes, how vegetation responds, how people recognize safe areas, and how those observations fit together across generations. Once that living context is altered, recreating it elsewhere would not restore the original system. There is no second fault network producing the same river in another forest. There is no duplicate microbial community waiting on another continent. A laboratory can study preserved material, yet it cannot recreate the history that produced the community in its natural setting. The river itself may continue for a very long time. Its water may keep emerging from the same geological architecture, carrying heat from depths that human decisions cannot reach. What remains uncertain is everything around that process that depends on the surface. That is where the river's story becomes distinctly human. Geology can endure without permission. Ecosystems cannot always do so. Knowledge requires observers, communities, records, and a place where all of them can remain connected. The heat may continue rising through the rock, even if the forest changes above it. The deeper process can outlast every decision now being made. The living river, however, exists only while those decisions leave room for life, research, and memory to remain together.